When you look back at 2020 in 10 years, 5 years, even next year, what will you remember most? Working from home? Desperately trying to homeschool your kids on one laptop computer? Did you get sick? Will you think about the job you lost or the pay cut you took? Will you remember George Floyd and the protests his murder inspired? Or maybe your own experience of racism will create even sharper memories. Or maybe the worst is yet to come for you, for all of us. After all, we still need to make it through hurricane and wildfire season. It's only July, but 2020 has felt like a lifetime, and it's had more shocks than most people see in a decade. A raging pandemic, significant protests driven by systemic racism and police violence, and now we're at the mercy of what is likely to be one of the hottest summers on record. And what if I told you that in 5 or 10 years, 2020 might not seem so exceptional, that the only thing the coming years are sure to bring is more disasters, more extreme weather events, more failing systems, more compounding shocks. The challenges we're facing can feel overwhelming, too big to plan for or grapple with, especially when layered on top of one another. The bad news is each of these challenges conspire to make the others worse. Every shock, pandemic, heat wave, flood, made worse and in turn exacerbating the underlying stresses of climate change, racism, poor public health, and equity. And all too often, as COVID-19 is put on full display, poor and vulnerable communities are most impacted, which leads to further poverty and fragility, and so the cycle starts again. But here's the big idea. Let's not think about these as separate things, a pandemic that requires pandemic solutions, heat waves that require heat wave solutions, but rather as a web of connected risks and opportunities. There is good news. Linking these, rather than treating them in isolation, allows us an opportunity to tackle them at once and with efficiency. Over the past decade, a new field has emerged called urban resilience. Its innovation is to recognize how these risks and the communities face can be and should be seen together. And by addressing them at once, we can make our communities stronger and more resilient to whatever the next thing comes their way. This is important for 2 reasons. The first of which is that we do not do a good job of predicting the next crisis. I was Deputy Commissioner of Emergency Management in New York in the late 90s and early 2000s. In the late 90s, we thought the next big thing was going to be a hurricane hitting New York. Then, on 9/11, 2 planes flew into 2 buildings. In the ensuing years, we had anthrax letters, a plane crash in Queens, a great Northeast blackout of 2003, the financial crisis of 2008, and only in 2012 did we have Superstorm Sandy. How can communities make sense of and prepare for all of these events at the same time? The answer is by building strength across their systems, meeting the basic needs of their most vulnerable, developing good governance with strong stakeholders at the table, promoting diverse and equitable economies, supporting cohesive communities where neighbors check on neighbors, all underpinned by sustainable infrastructure that is good for multi-use. All of those capacities help cities respond to, recover from, and in fact grow in the face of risk and adversity. This isn't easy. Silos began to spring up around particular disciplines in the 20th century. Transportation, economic development, social services, because it could seem more efficient for experts to talk to experts. But we launched 100 Resilient Cities and later Resilient Cities Catalyst to help cities change the way they approach their risks and opportunities, to do it in more integrated, inclusive, and strategic ways. Let me give you 3 examples of how this is playing out at large and small scales. I told you the big idea was to see our challenges as interconnected and to try to address them together. This idea came out in part from Medellin, Colombia in the 1990s. Today, Medellin is thriving and one of the world's most livable cities. But at the time, it was rife with violence and murder. It was home to the Medellin cartel, and the infamous Pablo Escobar, and it was on the verge of complete collapse. To address this violence, planners in Colombia looked at the causes of criminality. Medellin is a mountain city, as you can see here. Its main economic center is in the valley floor, and its poorest communities are perched precariously on hillsides. It used to take up to 3 hours down a windy mountain road on the back of a bus or on a motorcycle to reach the good jobs in the valley center. That left communities isolated, hopeless, and criminalized. What Medellin did is design a new transportation system that helped connect those communities to the economic opportunities. It started with bus rapid transit, into gondolas, and finally to escalators. For many, it reduced commute times by over half. Of course, authorities did kill Escobar, and they did dismantle the cartel. But in part because of improved life chances for Medellin's poorest, murder and violence reduced by nearly 90% over the ensuing decade and a half. The program had other benefits and impacts as well that helped make Medellin stronger and more resilient. It led to better air quality, a reduction in the city's carbon footprint, improved economy, and stronger communities due to the reduced commute times. That is what we call the resilience dividend, an intervention that starts with one purpose, in this case, to break the cycle of violence by increased economic opportunities, and leads to other benefits that reduce fragility and improve resilience. Let's travel to Paris to see what this looks like closer to present day. In 2014, when I first met Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo, she was very focused on climate challenges. She wanted to talk about flooding, urban heat, and air pollution. But then 2015 happened. 2 terrorist attacks and a refugee crisis. I told you, we don't do a good job of predicting what comes next. The opportunity for Paris was to figure out a way to address both immigration, refugees, and radicalization at the same time as dealing with its climate challenges. To do that, the city needed space. At 9.5% of its land, Paris has some of the least amount of green space for any world capital. Paris officials, led by Chief Resilience Officer Sébastien Maire, started small. In 2017, they chose 3 schools in neighborhoods that primarily serve immigrant and low-income communities. With the help of students, climate change activists, school construction authority, and immigrant advocates, the city redesigned those spaces to include light-colored building materials, bushes and trees to address the heat, permeable surfaces to capture and hold rainwater, and they opened the spaces on off hours and the weekends to the community so that the immigrants and refugees, the city's newest members, had a place to meet, mingle, and to make sense of their new home. Again, let's notice the resilience dividend, an intervention that starts with one purpose, in this case, to break the urban heat island through cool green spaces, and adds other benefits to make the community stronger and more resilient. Here, Paris improved stormwater management and community access to protect against floods and mitigate radicalization caused by isolation. The project was wildly popular, and now Paris has both plans and budget to do all 561 schools, which account for more than 700 acres of land. But these projects don't have to be big, and they don't have to be city-led. Here's a final example from Repowering London, a nonprofit formed to help social housing residents convert to solar power. Although their core work is solar power on rooftops, the team noticed vacant lots near rail stations. The community-based organization worked out a deal with the London Transport Agency to use these discarded parcels, and the Energy Garden was born. It began as another way to introduce solar power into communities, but thanks to integrated design by the group, they discovered other resilience dividends. There are now 34 energy gardens across Greater London, and they account for thousands of square meters of repurposed trackside land. Just this act alone, cleaning and greening vacant space, can have a major effect on the community. Just to give you one data point, a 2018 study in Philadelphia looking at the impact of simple, cheap greening of vacant lots found that it had significant impact on mental health of the community. It decreased feeling depressed by 42% for those living near the lots as opposed to the control group. In London, the garden teams installed solar panels and sold that power back to the grid. This provides a revenue source and demonstrates the benefits of small, renewable energy projects. The teams also had hundreds of volunteers and community groups. They engaged local authorities. They held public consultations because they knew that part of this effort was building cohesive communities, which ultimately leads to a more resilient neighborhood and city. Finally, the gardens are small examples of what every city needs: healthy local food and biodiversity. Community members, they harvested a variety of vegetables, and spring flowers supported bees, which are critical to biodiversity and so important in our cities, and yet the bee populations are declining in London and cities all around the world. And hops were used to make energy garden ale, which we all know is the official drink of any crisis. Like the Paris schoolyards and the Medellin gondolas, but on a smaller scale, each of these outcomes builds strength and capacity across multiple areas, strengthening the neighborhood and the community so that it can respond, recover, and grow in the face of all shocks. I'm going to leave you with one last story before we finish up. Earlier, I mentioned that years ago, I worked at the New York City Office of Emergency Management. I've just completed a 3-month secondment there to help the city through the most acute phase of the COVID pandemic. I supported the city's food czar and helped design and implement the emergency food home delivery program, bringing meals to COVID and food vulnerable New Yorkers. At its peak, we were delivering more than 1 million meals a day. And that's impressive and important work, and of that, I am incredibly proud and grateful. But it was a blunt tool. At a citywide scale, we didn't have the ability to truly understand vulnerability and deliver the appropriate meals, whether that was vegetarian, halal, kosher, prepared meals, or pantry boxes, or culturally sensitive meals for the vast immigrant populations we were serving. Our partnerships with community-based organizations served us well, but we needed more. Only at a community level, working with community leaders, can we truly understand a neighborhood's needs. To do that, to really build resilience, we need to get down at that level and strengthen the city and the neighborhoods that we're working at. As you start to think about what 2020 has in store for you the rest of the way, or what's around the corner in 2021 or 2025, you might possibly start to ask yourself what you can do in the face of it all. As you emerge from lockdown, what can we do differently so that we're ready for the next big thing? My advice to you is act small, but act now. Join a local organization, clean up a vacant lot, get to know your neighbors. This act alone will make your city, your community, your neighborhood more resilient. And I suspect this is going to be important in the years and months to come. Thank you very much.